In truth, its text is apocalyptic and revelatory, and almost certainly written long after the events it supposedly describes. Couched within the text are so many allusions to the Legio's later splintering that most authorities agree the text must be a cipher of sorts. A beautiful lie intended to salvage the Legio's tattered reputation in the wake of the Great Heresy. The so-called schism, which saw the ever-factionalised Legio pursue open warfare against itself, is at the heart of their conflicted history, but the tale requires framing within the context of its home. Few voidcraft ply the fractious routes that surround the Nebula Discordia. Scattered across the corewards front of this treacherous stellar nursery lies a web of systems. Periodically isolated from one another by the nebula's fierce and unpredictable solar winds, these worlds are only intermittently connected with one another, and have long proven targets tempting for opportunistic pirates and Xenos predators that give the region its name, the Corsair Worlds cluster. Even as the Imperium laid claim to the cluster, petitions streamed in from newly compliant worlds for succour and protection. Greedy for the rare star-forged materials that littered the young star systems, Mars demanded immediate action. With no extant forge world nearby, individual titans were tithed, despite vociferous protests from maniples attached to the expeditionary fleets which had brought the cluster into compliance. The actions of these titans form the heroic prehistory detailed in the Legio Maximalis, a series of fierce campaigns collectively known as the Clausura War, fought against entrenched alien conclaves and petty empires. The details of these conflicts are detailed elsewhere, but it was during this period that it became clear that the Corsair Worlds would require war groups able to operate independently for long periods. All too often, a maniple or lone titan would find itself worldbound on a hostile planet, isolated from support by the vicissitudes of the nebula. Some decades later, the long-awaited mandate for the raising of a new Legio arrived from Mars. Expecting to be relieved of their posting and anticipating return to their worlds of origin, the Princeps then in the region were instead informed in no uncertain terms that they and their titans would form the kernel of a new Legio. Regrettably, records the Liber, such honour was as often scorned and railed against as hailed, and numerous engines ignominiously stole away that should have stayed. As its forge throne, the Legio was assigned Edd Ralph, a desolate, rain-lashed planet located in the somewhat more stable southern reaches of the cluster. For reasons as varied as honour debt, doctrinal obedience, or simply because the ruthless demands of the Great Crusade saw stranded titans reluctantly abandoned, a scant dozen titans were gathered in the whipping rains of their new worlds. They and their crews hailed from as far afield as Orestes Colonia, Griffin IV, and Krytos, and made for a mournful sight in their crowdless inaugural parade. Tasked with shepherding those war engines newly commissioned from the resource-rich worlds of the cluster, the new Legio was to take its name and guidance from the ancient Eighth Law. The Omnissiah knows all, comprehends all. This, alongside the other mysteries and warnings of the cult, were known as the cult maxims, and the Legio was thus inaugurated as the Legio Maximal. Within a decade, a score of engines stood clad in the Legio's new tinctures, but the demands of war meant that they were continually embroiled in the struggle for the cluster. From the Legio's genesis, Edd Ralph thus only occasionally hosted more than a handful of the Vigilance Titans, and then only for ritual purposes. The risk of the nascent Forge world itself becoming embroiled in a storm, and the strength of the Legio confined, was too great. Instead, the Legio's strength was divided amongst the Arx Mechanicus Maximal, a roving fleet of war barges that was intentionally dispersed in order to ensure rapid response to calls for aid, and to avoid too great a portion of Legio Maximal's strength becoming isolated or marooned by void storms. Maximal's watchful and responsive nature quickly earned them a reputation amongst their allies within and beyond the region, leading to their low Gothic cognomen. The Vigilants thus developed an uncommonly nomadic and decentralised culture influenced as much by the personalities of their founding Princeps as the demands of their domain. Even as the founders themselves died away through attrition or age, their influence lived on. Devotion to charismatic individual leaders became ensconced, celebrated and ritualised amongst the Legio, with individual subfleets developing their own idiosyncrasies and traditions that were only rarely challenged or even witnessed by Edd Ralph. It was against this backdrop that the War Master Horus was to loom large. Never favouring a particular class of Titan, the Vigilants usually fielded flexible loadouts based on a great reverence for data. Comprehension, after all, was their founding principle. With worlds frequently and unexpectedly going dark, any information, however out of date, was valuable to the Liberators as they came to relieve their charges. Likewise, flexibility was favoured by crews who knew that their Titan was ever vulnerable to being stranded and self-reliant for years on end. A melting pot of cultures from its inception, Legio Maximal's martial identity remained occluded. While its actions were demonstrably effective, the Vigilants gradually gained an unwanted reputation for inconsistency, though the Liber Maximalis glosses this as adaptiveness. The influence dominant Princeps had on the forces they commanded exacerbated this tendency. Beyond a universal reverence for analysis and data infeeds, Vigilants embarked upon one arc might act in a cautious manner to a plea for aid, while others might rush in. When the Horus heresy erupted, it was this individualistic tendency that would tear the Legio apart. The schism, as it was to become known, saw the sub-fleet commanders of the Vigilants declare for opposing sides. For the traitor elements, no man was greater than the War Master, and his influence far outweighed the little regard they held for Nebet Pele. Roughly a third of Legio Maximal is believed to have declared for Horus, while the greater portion remained loyal, though in both instances the reasons for such declarations were many and varied. Besides these crude groupings were a number of maniples isolated at the start of the war, which stood aghast when clearing storms meant they were confronted with the stark realities of intra-Legio warfare. A number opted to stand aloof, secede, or flee the region, their actions again dictated by the varied motives of individual Princeps. Recalling the desperate fighting against all manner of Xeno gigabeasts and archaeo engines of the Corsair War, Legio Maximal turned upon itself, its thirst for data finding a bloody conclusion in self-immolation. With no secrets from one another, the brother war engines found their conflict increasingly dictated by a willingness to employ novel or downright risky strategies. In this dark time, innovation and a predilection for pushing their reactors to extremes became a morbid hallmark of the Vigilants. Gambit was met by gambit, and the outcome of this fratricidal war was far from certain.